into a fund
Ah,
that goes to the tribal group. It's a way of enacting an ethic of accountability, right?
that's
So like,
great.
nobody's forcing anybody to do anything, but it's a way for people to say, I acknowledge that I am on the traditional, you know,
Mhm.
territories that were unjustly taken by my government from these people. And in that way, it enables these groups to be able to function as governments, and to even to maintain lands or to buy back lands. I don't
Yes.
know, I don't know much about how the funds are used. I know that uh, in Oakland, which is the Segurite Land Trust, they were given a very small piece of land, like a quarter of an acre, and in the heart of Oakland. And they set up this, they set it up as a land trust. And it's a space for the Native community to come together and other communities and have events and do farming and things like that.
Wow.
So and then, in Seattle, and maybe Noah might know more about this than I do, but the Duwamish, in both cases, these are tribes that are not federally recognized tribes. I
Ah,
know that the Duwamish are seeking federal recognition, but they are the original people of Seattle. In fact, Seattle is named for their chief, Sealth, and I'm sure I'm not pronouncing that right, but this here the city is named for a very famous chief for which the city is named, and yet the tribe has
did not.
absolutely no political power. And so this is a way for these groups to exercise a form of agency, really.
Another question, which is kind of enormous, and I'm sure feeds into the real dreams of Native Americans. But if we're going to have true justice, true restorative land justice for Native Americans, would we give all the land in the whole country to them? That's the question of one of our participants.
Right. I mean, hypothetically speaking,
Yeah,
I mean, I guess, I don't know, but
yeah.
um, there, if you were to take it all the way, break it all the way down, in terms of the treaties where land,
Mhm.
which were all about land cessions, then
Yes.
you'd have to talk about, well, under what conditions were those lands ceded? And it was always under duress. It was, tribes
Yeah.
never said, here, let's make a tribe and we'll give you our land, right? It was never that. It was always, they were aggressively pursued at the barrel of a gun. And, and it didn't even have to go that way. Like, it didn't have to happen that way. Native people had, from the beginning, they said to settlers, you can come live here among us, just,
Yeah.
live in respect, right? And respectful
Mhm.
relationship. But of course that was never maintained. Um, but I mean, hypothetically speaking, yeah, I guess, you'd have to give all the land back, and then Indians would be like the landlords, and everybody could stay here, but
Yeah.
then you pay, right? But we're the landlords. But,
Right.
that's that would never happen, of course, but it is definitely happening in little chunks here and there.
Yeah.
And there's
Mhm.
certainly a push for things like, all the national parks, right, and the
Mhm.
public lands. I mean, let's face it, in the US, in the Western US, almost
For
half of
Native American.
all the land in the US is public lands. It's
Mhm.
state parks, national parks, those kinds of things. And so there is, David Troyer wrote a brilliant piece a few months ago in the Atlantic about that, about, just turn all those public lands back over to tribes. We manage them better anyway.
Yes.
So,
Yes. Mhm.
and that's one of the arguments that's been made, is that, Native people have always been better land managers than the Europeans, and that, right, in the critical moment that we're in, that's what traditional
Yes.
ecological knowledge does, is it teaches scientists that there are different ways to handle these problems, that you do need to start looking at the way Native people managed landscapes in order to come to better outcomes.
Mm-hmm. I was speaking recently with a big fire captain who was saying that he consults with the Kumeyaay, for how to do certain burns and certain other things because they just have more knowledge of that. Another question that came up, Dina, I think we're going to keep questioning you here until you scream enough. How does a group get recognized federally as a tribe?
It's a brutal process. They have to apply the federal, what's it called? The LA, there's an acronym for it, but it's a process that goes through the BIA, the Bureau of Indian Affairs.
Yeah.
And it's a brutal process. There are, at any given time, there are something like 200 or more groups who are on that list seeking recognition, and it can take 20 or 30 years to meet the criteria, and most don't. And the reason is because, well, a lot of those groups really are illegitimate. They're groups that don't have, or certainly can't demonstrate a legitimate, ongoing existence as nations in the U.S. Some seek recognition just for the benefits, but it's a brutal process that will cost millions of dollars for the group seeking it. I've watched it. I've seen it happen more than once, and it scrutinizes people in ways that are humiliating, in ways that are, here you're asking, especially here in California, where the genocide was so brutal and so deliberate, that people had to literally go into hiding in order to survive. And so this is this history. And now that they have the freedom to not be killed for being Indian, they are coming out and saying, we have always been here, we have maintained our communities, because that's what the criteria is about. You have to prove that you maintained your collective existence in several different categories. And so, but how do you do that when you literally, in order to survive, you had to change your identity?
Yeah.
So yeah, it's a horrible process.
That's very interesting. You haven't mentioned language. What is, and I know that having had over my 35-year education history, a number of Native American students, one of my first things, because I was also an English as a second language instructor at different times, I always said to them, keep your language, don't let your language die. And that was, an issue already 30 years ago. Kids saying, well, I know some of the words in my, Native American language, but I can't really speak it completely with my grandmother. I just know some of the words. Can you address that issue? Because I would think that would be part of sovereignty and the tribe keeping a sense of who we are, is keeping their language alive.
Yeah, it's central to it. It's critically important. And, and we have, we talk about what the processes of assimilation historically have been about. And, one of the things that this term that comes out of Latin American studies, this term epistemicide. And this describes the killing of knowledge systems. And knowledge systems always are based on languages. And so linguicide is another term, right? The killing of a language, the deliberate killing of a language is part of the killing of a knowledge system. And of course, that was, it was targeted, our languages were targeted in the boarding school systems, And
Yeah.
this is why I don't have my traditional language, because, my grandmother was boarding schooled, and whatever
Uh,
language she had was beaten out of her, literally. And my, her siblings that went to the school with her. So there has been a long standing push now that we have the freedom, like there's now value in rejuvenating and revitalizing those languages. And there's even, plenty of evidence that shows that bilingualism enhances
yes,
education outcomes for all kinds of students. And
yes,
so, because it
absolutely.
used to be the logic was like, no, we have to be monolingual because
Mhm.
it just confuses students or whatever. But now we know that's BS. And um, so we have, there's all kinds of language revitalization programs. And we really see I love the example in Hawaii, in
Mhm.
the Hawaiian context, where the language was almost completely obliterated. But somebody said to me the other day, they characterized it in this way about, like, when you think about the killing of knowledge or language and it being gone, like, or appears to be gone, sometimes we'll use the term it's dormant. um, or if you think of a metaphor of a fire, like a fire might appear to be out, but there's embers in there and in the coals, and all it takes is an ember to start a fire right from there. And so this is really a way to think about those languages and how Native people approach them. Sometimes there are times when they probably will not be able to be completely reconstructed because
Mhm.
it's been so destroyed.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
you can bring back the frameworks of them. And in another thing to think about these languages is, even when the languages are gone, the languages still construct. They're like the frames of a window, and
Mhm.
and they still construct a worldview that can be maintained even in a different language. And
Mhm.
that's really what we're seeing, like, for people like me who don't have my original language. I still have the worldview of the culture that I came from, and ultimately that's really what's the most important. Because there's this saying, they say, if you don't have your language, you kill the culture. And I personally don't believe that.
That's great. I'm glad that's true, because we have had some California Native American languages that have unfortunately disappeared. They weren't able to, in trying to create dictionaries and preserve what was known, there just wasn't enough left. And that always makes me so sad, because I felt it was a culture disappearing. So I like your view much better. And I think it is true. But it also hints at the danger of killing the knowledge too. And that was the point of the boarding schools. Can you speak just very briefly? I'm not sure everybody understands just how devastating and what the genocidal point of the boarding schools were, as far as it affected Native American culture.
Yeah. So the US, of course, went through several different policy periods in terms of how they treated American Indians. And it went from, outright extermination to, or treating. Actually, it really begins with making treaties for land cessions and for friendship,